The woman who was considered the first American poet was a Puritan, but she was no Puritan. Anne Bradstreet wrote poems that were passionate and popular. She was a young English gentlewoman, to use a phrase of that time, who became a pioneer in the untamed forests of the New World, the daughter of the man who was deputy governor of the Massachusetts Bay Colony, but her artistic success challenged Puritan theocracy. Charlotte Gordon is also a New England poet, albeit almost 4 centuries after Anne Bradstreet. Miss Gordon has written a biography called Mistress Bradstreet, The Untold Life of America's First Poet. Charlotte Gordon joins us from member station WBUR in Boston. Thanks so much for being with us.
I'm so glad to be here, Scott.
I would like you to take us back to the 1600s, as you do just so effectively in the book, because in addition to all else that it is, the book is the best depiction I've read of life in the colonies in the 1600s. Help us, if you can, to appreciate what it took to travel to what was, after all, in the minds. Actually, not everybody was even convinced that there was another part of the globe,
Right.
that this place actually existed.
It was a frightening journey to contemplate, and for many of the Puritans who decided they were going to take this trip, it was almost a foregone conclusion that they were going to die. And many of the sermons that they listened to and that their ministers wrote before they left the old world, England, were about preparing the way for their own death.
When the colonists arrive, of course, it's not as if there was anything waiting for them. They had to build everything from scratch.
When Anne and her family arrived, they found a teeny little settlement filled with starving, despairing men. And in fact, it was so miserable a sight that they almost immediately took off for the South. And that, in fact, is one of the original stories of the founding of Boston, that Salem was so forlorn and grim a sight that these colonists went south to a wilderness they had yet to call Boston.
Your book also reminds us of what was then really the very brutal arithmetic of childbirth.
For a woman, going into childbirth was not unlike a man setting off for war. You could not expect that you would come back alive.
It's one thing to try and bear a child in the relatively settled and for the time certainly sophisticated environment of, let's say, the south of England. But in the wilderness that was then the New World, that was then America, with the lack of resources, this must have been particularly daunting.
I think it was really terrifying, and it certainly put every pious woman's faith to a sort of powerful test, one it's hard for us to imagine today. For Anne, who spent many years sobbing because she couldn't have a baby, we don't hear so much of her despair and fear going into childbirth, because for her it was such a blessing that she was at last going to have a child.
Perhaps we need to be explicit. Half the children born could be expected to die.
Yes.
And of course, in the theocracy that was Puritan society, anything that happened to you was seen as the direct hand of God, and therefore the death of a child, or the inability to bear a child, or in the case of Anne Bradstreet, a personal sickness, was seen as a character flaw.
That's right, and it put a certain amount of pressure on a faithful person to be reading the world in this way, so that search the skies, and if it was cloudy or dark, you might have to search your conscience and think, what have I been doing wrong to bring this bad weather upon us? If you couldn't get pregnant, what had you been doing wrong to bring this punishment to bear?
Anne Bradstreet began to write poems to atone for getting sick.
Yes.
Explain to us how this happened, because as I think you note in the book, other women who were sick, to atone for their illness, might crochet a pillow or something.
Anne surprises us all by writing her first poem after she recovers from a long illness from which she thought she would die. Yet that she turned to the pen at this time was a remarkable thing for a woman to do. Many Puritan women could read during this era, but not many could write. But Anne had been selected as the favorite daughter by her father and had been taught to write and to study poetry.
Didn't she have some problems at first convincing people that the poems were her own because women didn't write poetry?
That's a lament that she makes many times in her work, where she says, again and again, if what I do proves well, they'll say I stole it. They'll say I was a thief.
Could you give us an early example of a poem that, as you read through them, caught your eye and suggested to you this was an exceptional talent?
This is a very famous poem of Anne's, and it's one of the early ones that I loved, and it's called To My Dear and Loving Husband. If ever two were one, then surely we. If ever man were loved by wife, then thee. If ever wife was happy in a man, compare with me, ye women, if you can. I prize thy love more than whole mines of gold, or all the riches that the East doth hold. My love is such that rivers cannot quench, nor aught but love from thee give recompense. Thy love is such I can no way repay. The heavens reward thee manifold, I pray. Then, while we live, in love let's so persever, that when we live no more, we may live ever.
It's a beautiful poem, and as you make plain, it has the quality of being smoldering if you read just a little bit between the lines, too. She was a very passionate woman.
These were meant for his eyes alone, and she says some astonishing things that would make even our ears, perk up. She wants him to come burn inside of her. She yearns for his body, she says. She misses him in her bed, and she's pretty direct about it.
I marked a poem, I think it was written 1645, before the birth of one of her children. I was just so touched by it. May I read a little bit from this one?
Yes.
If you can tell us the circumstances. Anne Bradstreet, I guess she's expecting another childbirth, and she writes a poem to her husband Simon. How soon, my dear, death may my steps attend. How soon may be thy lot to lose thy friend. If any worth or virtue were in me, let that live freshly in thy memory. And when thou feelest no grief, as I no harms, yet love thy dead who long lay in thine arms. And when thy loss shall be repaid with gains, look to my little babes, my dear remains. And if thou love thyself, or lovest me, these, O protect from stepdame's injury. She's already opening the possibility that he's going to marry again.
Yeah, that was a working assumption in the colonies that the husband would remarry quite shortly thereafter, in part to take care of the children and the house.
Why do you think she wrote poetry?
It was such an unusual choice for a woman to make at that time, and such a dangerous one. And she speaks to that. She says in one of her most famous lines, I am obnoxious to every carping tongue that says my hand and needle better fits. And it seems as though she really found sustenance. And for many Puritans, in fact, for most of the Puritans who came to the New World, writing was a form of prayer. It was a way of connecting to God. And she began her life really with a kind of young person's attention to fame. She writes about her ambitions in an indirect way. And she uses lots of fancy language and lots of learned allusions as though she's trying to show her reader how much she knows. But as time goes on, her poetry adopts what she would have called a plain style and becomes, therefore, what we would think of as more American. And it's really in Anne that we see this first shift towards a New English or American literary identity.
Miss Gordon, very nice to talk to you.
Thank you, Scott.
Charlotte Gordon's new book is Mistress Bradstreet, The Untold Life of America's First Poet. To read poems by Anne Bradstreet, you can come to our website, npr.org.